long time, and today we're talking about how to deal with the pain that ministry can bring. We can all relate to that. I hope you enjoy today's coaching conversation. Man, how can I serve you today?
Man, I'm just really excited. I'm excited for tomorrow or this week later on. But for sure, going into the new year, and this is just kind of like a phase that I've been in my life lately. And it's just like the pursuit of wholeness as a leader, as a pastor, or whatever. And so I kind of have the first one kind of stems from there. And what are like some habits that all leaders or pastors either should implement or stop? And it really comes again from the root of I'm really pursuing wholeness and I don't know, just being a better version of me.
Yeah, no, that's great. Let me ask you this before we jump into the habit concept and ideas there. When you say wholeness, what does wholeness as a leader mean to you? What does that look like?
I think winning at home and winning at ministry. That's what I would say, wholeness. I think that question has been like, how do you balance ministry and life? I think that's been phrased a lot. I think for me right now, that change of pursuing wholeness, it feels less like a balance that I'm trying to like do, and then more of like a state that I get to live in. So that's why we're using the word wholeness more.
Yeah. Well, one, I love the pursuit of it. I love that you're saying, hey, man, I want more balance in my life. I want wholeness. Let me talk about the habits that I'm creating, and let me explore the habits. That's what you're really saying, David, is, hey, I want to explore those things. One thing is when it comes to boundaries in ministry, we've always got to remember that we're priests to our home first, before we are to a church. That we've got the boundaries that are set by us. So when someone says, man, they're running me ragged, it's like, well, you're allowing that. You cannot change what you choose to tolerate. And if you constantly are saying, man, I'm running ragged and my life's out of balance, it's like, well, yeah, but most of the time in the ministry, we're the ones to blame for that. Because we're allowing ourselves to be run ragged. We're allowing people to infringe in on boundaries. We're not willing to address the changes, and you can't change what you choose to tolerate. And so I think that's the first thing is I think one of the greatest jobs of a leader is both to define reality and to take responsibility. Define reality, take responsibility. So your reality is, hey, maybe my life's a little out of balance. Maybe yours is, I don't know. But I also need to take responsibility. No one else is going to fix that for me. Yeah. No one is going to come up to your church and go, we think your life's out of balance. Well, you need to spend more time at home. Most people are not going to do that. Most people in your church are coming to you I always say, whenever I have an appointment, whenever you're a pastor and you have an appointment, it's usually centered around counseling, complaining, or cash. They want one of three. so
one of the big three C's.
Yeah, that's right. Counseling, I got a complaint, I want some counseling, or I need some cash. And I know that's funny and a little sarcastic, but no one sits down with you and says, I care about you, Pastor. I want to make sure your life's in boundaries. Like no one's ever had that conversation with me in my years of being in ministry. And so you're going to have to decide, okay, first I'm going to have to define reality, and I'm going to have to take responsibility, and I'm going to have to set those things. The other thing is, I think we often go for these kind of superpower habits. Like I'm going to create this massive habits. And I just have noticed that true leadership and true advancement as a leader isn't done through the superpower habit, if you will. It's just a phrase I'm making up, but a superpower habit. I'm going to do this big, huge habit. It's like, it's really done in the small things that are done consistently. It's really what it is. It's just finding the one or two habits. Instead of viewing these big old habits, of going into the new year, man, what's one or two things that if I just did this consistently, it would change a lot in my marriage. If I just did this consistently, it would change a lot in my leadership. It would change a lot in my balance. Not a big, huge, but just what's one or two things that I could change that when done consistently would change everything. The third thing I would say about that is I think that often as people head into a new year, they often focus on what, not how.
Yeah.
This is what I'm going to do. It's like, but how are you actually going to do that? What's the actual step you're going to take? So consider that as well. Those are the things that I'd consider about own the boundaries. Own the boundaries and find the one or two little small habits that really make a big difference. They don't have to be big habits. They could just be small ones.
Yeah. No, and even after the how, I think it's even the why also.
Yeah,
Why are
of
we doing
course.
it?
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah. The why is what roots you to the outcome. The why is what
Yeah.
roots you to stay faithful to it when you want to go the other way or you want to drift. The why always does that. So absolutely, it's rooted in that. But a lot of people say, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to be this. I'm going to become this. But how are you going to actually do that? Find one or two things that, when done consistently, make a big difference.
Cool.
Years and years and years ago, a guy that I knew in the church that did very well financially, I just said, hey man, I'm in ministry. I'm not making millions of dollars. And he gave me three little words. I thought, boy, that could go almost anywhere. He said, just invest with discipline. And invest with discipline. And I thought, boy, that's a great statement for money. That's a great statement for my marriage. That's a great statement for my leadership. Just invest with discipline. Doesn't have to be big. Just invest with discipline. And the compound effect is what will change everything.
That's actually really good.
Yeah.
Kind of on that same train of thought, without getting into any details, but my family went through a crisis a couple of years ago, and I think that's really the root of this whole like being more intentional about always pursuing wholeness. But in the midst of, as a leader, you go through pain, you go through crisis, you go through letdowns, you go through hurts. How do you it might be a deeper question that I need to do with my therapist, but I think as a leader, it's a great question to ask of like, how do you get back on the horse? And in your way of protecting yourself, you kind of start pushing people away, which is kind of hard as a leader. And so how do you, what's a good balance? What's a good metric there? What's a good habit, or however you want to say, guide to, or boundary, honestly, to walk that fine line of, I want to be close to people. And I don't know, embrace pain. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I love it, man. Well, first, I love the vulnerability of the question. Anybody that's listening to this podcast is, you can't be in ministry or in any form of leadership and not go through pain. It's just going to happen. People are going to hurt you, and people are going to surprise you how much they hurt you. Things are going to happen that you didn't expect are going to happen. And I think that is a big question, but man, I think let's talk about it for a few minutes. Although it's a therapist type question. How do you, I think just some thoughts off the top of my head is, how do you create tough skin and a soft heart? Because if you have a tough heart, then that's not going to work. You got to have tough skin. Like, I can handle this. I know how to deflect. Tough skin. I know how to deflect. I know how to not take it personally. I always say that when someone hurts you or someone complains or comes at you, treat it like chewing gum. You chew it, but you don't swallow. You don't take it all in. It's just like, okay, I'll learn what I can from it, but then I'm going to move on. I'm going to keep that tough skin, but I'm also going to keep a soft heart. I'm going to make sure that I don't choose suspicion over trust, but that I choose trust over suspicion. You're going to choose suspicion over trust or trust over suspicion. And the more you get hurt, the more someone's going to come into your life as a leader, join your team, and you're going to put them under the shadow of suspicion based on what someone else did. Rather than saying, you got a clean slate with me, and I'm going to trust you until you prove me otherwise. And those are I know that sounds, just like, oh, just say it's not easy. I get it. I really get it, because we've all bled. I've bled in ministry, and people have hurt me, and I have a situation that happened just recently where I was like, wow, I can't believe this person, after all I've done,
Yeah.
you feel like, wow, and that's real, man. That's vulnerable. That's real. That's authentic. I love the honesty of this conversation, but I do think tough skin, soft heart is one thing to remember. I think choosing trust over suspicion rather than suspicion over trust is really important, and not allowing what someone else did to become how you treat another person.
Yeah.
And I also think one thing is those that are closest to you. I had this conversation one time with an executive I work with on the team, on one of our teams that I operate. And I remember saying, we were building a good friendship, and he was doing a lot of great work, and I'd known him before anyway. And I just said, just so you know, I was hurt over here, and now you're working with me. And if there's ever a moment where you feel like I'm judging you according to someone else's circumstance or behavior from the past, please call me on it. I think that did two things. One, he called me on it. I wouldn't say all the time, but probably first 2 years, probably called it on me every 6-7 months where, hey, I feel like you're judging me according to someone else's situation. One, he handled that right, and it gave him license to let me know when I'm doing that. Two, it also showed incredible vulnerability on my side. And also, I think that creates an equity and a trust when you're vulnerable.
Yeah.
And having that honest conversation. I don't think you have it with everybody. I don't think you can have it with everybody. I don't think you should have it with everybody. But there are a few people in your life that are close to you in ministry that you need to be able to say, call me on it. And I always tell leaders, don't be afraid to bleed. It creates vulnerability. And that vulnerability and honesty is what gives you equity with them and what actually helps the relationship. I don't know if that helps, but
no, it helps a lot, because I think there's a tension that, I don't know, maybe it doesn't, I haven't heard it being spoken of too much, but it's like the pastor that becomes a friend, but then that line becomes really blurry, and then people, it's not the title or the authority card. It's legit. I get so close to someone, and then you lose that. Those lines start to bleed a little bit. Where okay, now I have he's my friend hat. Now he's my pastor hat. Now he's my boss hat. So I think there's a lot. Obviously, in every relationship is probably different, but there's a lot to be said about those nuances, I feel.
Yeah, you do. And I shared that I won't go into it too much, 'cause I did share it on a podcast, but knowing those lines of friendship and leadership, knowing what you can share and what you shouldn't share. You have to draw those lines. And when you start choosing friendship over leadership, it usually ends up hurting you. You got to be able to know where those lines are. You got to know when to be vulnerable. And I think that kind of vulnerability, like, hey guys, I've been hurt. Hey, sit down with 2 or 3 of your executives. Guys, I've been hurt in the past. Nothing you guys did. But what will happen is I'll start judging you according to that light. And I need you to one-on-one call me on that if you feel that, because I don't want to do that to you. That statement, that just 45-second conversation I just had with you, as if I was you to 3 of your executives, that little 45 seconds will give you a ton of grace over the next year or two, because they'll know.
Yeah.
They'll know. They'll give you so much grace if you just are honest with them.
No, and I think that is gold, honestly. Like you have said a lot of really helpful things, and that is super gold right now for me, because that's really what happens. Like, crisis, pain, hurt shapes our life, and then you look at the rearview mirror, there is their intersection where you used to be like this and now you're like this, and and some people we honestly never look back and reflect to see, wait, my leadership style wasn't like this, or I didn't used to make people feel uncomfortable or whatever, and usually it traces back to something, and that's really good that your relationship with these people starts with hey, this is the intersection. So I might be tempted to go back to this route or this
Yep.
way of acting or talking or whatever. But that's really good. Um,
Yeah. Good. Good.
yeah. Another thought. I heard this phrase. It's kind of a very vague, bold one, but it's really been messing me up with, like in a good way, messing me up. Like when it
Yeah.
comes to structuring a church and when we build a church, and I say build because I know that God's the one that ultimately does it, but we're leaders and we have this, we're being stewards, right? And so the phrase was, build a church that will last 100 years. Build a church that will last 100 years. That
Mm.
thought really is kind of been on my mind for the past 3 weeks. And as we're talking about structures and we're talking about a lot of roles, even in our church, I know you're very aware of that. That thought is, it kind of really got me thinking of like, what does the church look like when it sets goals? As far as like, how do you build a church for 100 years, maybe? And that's like a
Yeah.
super vague question.
Yeah.
But when it comes to practical things, I think it splits it into what should be short-term goals that a church should have, and what are
Yeah.
long-term goals that a church should have.
Yeah. Well, that's good. I think that one, that's an interesting statement. You know, building a church last 100 years. I do think that just some quick thoughts. I've been doing a lot of thinking about that as well. Like how can you set the church up financially to win long after you're gone?
Hmm.
You know,
Yeah,
I've seen
yeah,
pastors do that. Unfortunately, I've seen the next pastor come in and blow it and ruin the entire thing. It's like the guy sets his empire and I've seen that more than once. But there's an example where they had, excuse me, they had probably, I don't know, the pastor kind of retired, and he handed it off to someone. I'm just giving an example,
yeah,
and that person got to sort of inherit what this guy built. Now, what I mean by that is he had a beautiful church in an incredible location, probably worth 15, 18 million, just the church itself.
wow,
Then he owned three or four, he had the vision to buy 4 or 5 houses on each side of the church and then rent them out so that someday if he wanted to expand, he could level the houses and build gymnasiums or whatever he wanted to build. He had built up, a couple $1 million in the bank and it was paid off.
wow,
That to me is, man, that guy thought about the future. He wasn't going to inherit. He had to
no,
go through all the work of buying these houses and raising the money and paying them off and, all that stuff over a period of 25 years so that someone would have that to stand on.
yeah,
And unfortunately, the next guy didn't do well with it and made a lot of mistakes and pretty much just, I wouldn't say destroyed, but wrecked the financial sort of stability that the guy created. I do think that there's things that you can look at for the future. I think a lot of it is centered around finances for the future and property. Because when you start talking about like, we're going
hmm,
to do this vision next year of feeding 10,000 people, the homeless. Well, that's not 20 years from now.
yeah,
That doesn't live past you. But when you
yeah,
start talking about setting the church up for a win financially, paid off property, more property that you own, endowments that you own, investments that you own, where it's like, man, I'm setting this church up to win for the future.
yeah,
Now, hopefully someone doesn't come along and wreck it. But man, when you talk about 100 years from now, I think obviously you're trying to build a good church, a God-loving church, Christ-centered church, making a difference, all that stuff. That's kind of the here and now. But when you're gone, or when you're, 90 years old, and, like
yeah,
you look back and go, man, I set them up for a win.
yeah,
I mean, the properties they own, like they could go on for years
yeah,
with what I set up. I think that's part of that. You asked the question. So one, I think we need to think about properties, finances, things like that
yeah,
set the church up for a win. I really do. I
mm,
think we need to think that way past just survival in our own sort of pastoral season. We need to think what about 20 years from now? What difference is going to
Yeah.
make? You know, what if I invested this now and the church kept paying it? Yeah, you know what? In 30 years, it's going to be huge, but I'll be gone in 15. Yeah, but now you're thinking about the future.
Yeah.
That's what I would think about as it pertains to 100 out. When I think about when you talked about short-term kind of goals or perspectives and long-term, I think that the difference is wrapped up in two words: vision and mission.
Mm-hmm.
Vision is where you're going. Mission is what you're doing.
Yeah.
So mission, we want to lead unchurched people, you know, like we always say at South Hills, the church that I founded, we want to lead unchurched people in a growing relationship with Jesus Christ. Well, that's what we do. But where are we headed? We want to, here's our vision. We want a church in every state and on every continent. And we want to make an impact on every state and on every continent by developing leaders and creating irresistible churches. That's where we're headed. Dude, every state and every continent, like that's going to go beyond me. That's a vision that goes way beyond me. What we do about leading unchurched, that happens every day. And I think you're separating out as a leader as you think to the future. What are we doing every day is our mission. It's who we are. It's what we're called to. But where we're going is probably going to outlast me. You separate the what and the where.
And honestly, I think that that's almost a starting point of that question. Really, it's like, if the church is going to last 100 years, it's your default is, what does the church look like without me? Without me carrying the whole thing, you know, or driving the boat or driving the ship or whatever you want to call it. You know, it's like you are no longer in the picture, and you are, you know, you're David leaving finances so that his son could build a temple. When you said finances, that's really what came to my mind. Is like, hey man, I could hire 3 more staff members, or I could set this aside for the future, and I'm never going to reap the rewards of this extra money in my budget. You know, it's like, I don't know. They're hard questions, because when they go back to like the practical day to day, it's choosing not me versus me, almost, you know, my time versus not my time.
Yep. And that is every generation, all these different millennials and Z's and Y's and R's and all these things, they're always going to create these challenges. And I think that the people that are alive at that moment and in ministry at that moment have to solve that what. But what we have to do as leaders is set it up for the future. You know, you hand off your ministry and go, okay, we're $6 million in debt. We don't have any money in the bank, and Joe's going to be the new pastor. Like, man, that's not exactly setting it up for a win. So I think there's some practical things we can do to set it up for a win. Now, what people do with that once you hand it to them, that's their decision. But you're able to rest knowing, and I set that church up for a win. And I think that's an important part of it. So, man, anything else you want to chat about today? Great questions.
No.
These have been incredible.
Thanks, man. No,
Cool.
yeah, I mean, it was just that. Like, if there's anything practical that the church could be doing to reach Gen Z, anything that jumps out the page for you, I love to hear it.
You know what, man, I think you got to get people around that understand what's happening in that world rather than trying to figure it out. Got to find a leader in that world. For sure. In any generation, you got to find a leader in that generation that says, this is how we are, this is how we think, this is what we do. I do 2 things. 1, I find a leader in that generation, and 2, I find someone else that's already doing well in that area. I don't think I have some big magic like, do this and that will reach them. I think, okay, who's doing a great job at it? What are they doing? And who's in that arena that is a natural born leader? It's like, I am a Gen Z, or I'm 1 or 2 years above it, but I can speak to it because the older you get, the more distance there is between really understanding that. And but doesn't mean they don't need to be reached. We just, you know, Paul says, to the Jew I become a Jew, to the Gentile I become a Gentile, you know, to the Z I find a Z, and I say, how do you reach these people? And then the next generation will come and it'll create a whole nother set of problems and challenges. But I think it's I think it's good that we don't look at it, I say set of problems, it's a set of opportunities for us to say, man, we can figure out how to reach these people in a way that they're not reached.
Yeah.
So
that's good.
That's what I would do. Yeah. Well, man, hey, dude, always great talking with you. You're an amazing leader, and you always have incredible questions. And and just love what you're doing. And man, God sure have blessed you and growing a really incredibly great sized church, and God's just doing awesome things. But man, thanks for being on it today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, Chris, thank you so much, man. Big hug. Appreciate you a lot.
Thanks, buddy.